Hey, everybody, welcome back to Phantom Astronaut. I am Decker, the Phantom Astronaut, and we have a really interesting midnight mystery school for you guys today. We're going to be talking a little bit about baseball with James St. Vincent. We're not a sports channel, but, and I don't even know that much about sports. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't really know that much about baseball as a sport, as a game, but I know about baseball culturally. And I want to talk to James a little bit about the paranormal connections with baseball because he's much more entrenched. He's a baseball fan. And I think about Field of Dreams. I think about that scene in The Natural, like in the beginning, the lightning, hits the tree and he makes the baseball bat. There's this great sort of mythology and superstition that goes hand in hand with baseball. And I'm trying to figure out why that is. So, James, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me up here in Santa Barbara, land of a lot of weird shit. But are we allowed to curse on Phantom Astronaut?
Yeah, of course.
No, I'll
I mean,
avoid
I
it.
don't know. I mean, we might get demonetized. I have no idea.
I'll try and avoid it.
I don't know how it works yet.
But baseball, I'm a big baseball fan. In fact, it's the only sport that I do like, that I do follow, and baseball's a very superstitious sport. It's very entrenched in American mythology, and I think a lot of that has to do with the game really came to prominence after the Civil War, when America was really coming back together and building its own mythology. And one of the first superhero, larger than life characters that we had in the United States that was involved in sport was Babe Ruth. And Babe Ruth, in fact, was involved in one of the biggest mythological superstitious things, the curse of the Bambino. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but
I know that it involved Boston,
it
and
involved
it was the
Boston.
it was the they Babe Ruth left and went to the Yankees. Is there
Yeah, well,
so what was
so
what was the whole thing about it?
well, before 1920, the Red Sox were arguably the most successful franchise in Major League Baseball, and Babe Ruth was a star player. And the owner of the Red Sox, Harry Freese, decided that he was going to, in order to fund a Broadway play called No No Nanette, he was going to sell Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees, and he sold him for $100,000. And supposedly, once Ruth started playing for the Yankees fans started chanting 1918, 1918, which was the last year that the Red Sox had won the World Series. And so the story goes, Babe Ruth was so mad at being sold from the Red Sox that he put a curse on the Red Sox franchise that they would never win another World Series. And for a long time, it seemed like the Red Sox were cursed. There were several seasons, 1975, they were in the World Series, lost a heartbreaker to the Cincinnati Reds. 1967, they called it the year of the impossible dream, and everybody was sure the Red Sox were going to win the World Series. They crumbled at the last minute. 86, they lost against the Mets. More on that later. And it went about until even in 2003, it looked like the Red Sox were going to get leapfrog over the Yankees in the championship series, and Aaron Boone got up and hit a home run in the 11th inning off of Tim Wakefield and sent the Yankees to the World Series, and everybody was just convinced that the Red Sox were cursed. Well, in 2004, the Yankees and the Red Sox met up again in the championship series to see who was going to go from the American League to the World Series. And the Red Sox were down 3 games in a 7-game series, and no team had ever come back from being down 3 games. And they came back, they won 4 in a row and went on to win the World Series. And that was the end of the curse. And rumor has it, now, this fact is an early internet fact, so this might not be around if you look it up. You might have a hard time finding this. But I heard back in 2004 that after the Red Sox finally won the World Series, a whole bunch of octogenarians, like the highest percentage that had ever died at one time, died in Boston. It was like people who were holding on to life just for the Red Sox to win the World Series dropped dead after they won because they were just so happy. I like to believe that that's true because that's kind of a romantic way to go.
Well,
But
I think that romanticism about baseball plays hand in hand with how we think about baseball and ghosts and the lingering past and things like Field of Dreams, like we mentioned, things
Hmm.
like Angels in the Outfield. The idea that is popular in our culture about baseball is that it's somehow intrinsically tied to the past, even though it is still obviously currently played, and there's many many millions of fans out there who love baseball and go to see baseball. But when we think of baseball culturally, we think of it almost retroactively,
Hmm.
and that lends itself toward this sort of paranormal Americana. Why do you think that is?
The game of baseball is very statistical heavy, and baseball fans love statistics. They love the lore. They love the history, and it's very alive. If you go to any baseball, any ballpark, you go to Dodger Stadium or Yankee Stadium or Fenway Park or Wrigley Field, they're almost like cathedrals. They're museums in a way. I mean, you go to Yankee Stadium, they have Monument Park with all the plaques dedicated to the players. And when I was a little kid, I thought those players were actually buried there in Monument Park. And my dad explained to me, no, that's not a cemetery. Those are just monuments toward them. But I also think because it's got a history that goes back further than basketball or football. So I think that it just can't help but have that folklore aspect to it. And it was it, I mean, if you think about what the population was in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, when baseball was the king sport, I mean, a higher percentage of Americans loved baseball. So it's just everybody's mom loved baseball. Everybody's dad loved baseball. So even baby boomers or older Gen Xers who maybe grew up to become bigger fans of basketball or football, baseball, especially with men, and this is a reason why Field of Dreams is one of those movies that always makes men cry because in some for some men, baseball and little league and learning to play catch and learning to play the game was the deepest connection that they ever had with their fathers.
Hmm.
And I think that even lives on today. I mean, I have very fond memories of my dad teaching me how to catch a baseball and how to hit a baseball and taking me to the batting cages. And it was a generational thing that was handed down. And I think it can't help but be part of the lure of Americana. And it is a very superstitious game. Like I was telling you the other day, even in Little League Baseball, being 7 or 8 years old, you're taught some of the superstitions. When you walk off the field, you never step on the white chalk foul line. That's bad luck. If you're not a pitcher, when you're walking off the field, you never step on the pitcher's mound. That's considered bad luck. And baseball players throughout history have had some notable superstitions and just things that they did in order to break out of slumps and things like that. Some recent guys were like Jason Giambi, who was a very famous player who played for the Oakland A's and the Yankees. When he would get into a slump, I'm not joking, he would wear a gold G-string under his uniform to try to break out of a slump. Um, Mark Teixeira, another famous player who played for the Yankees, he one day accidentally put on one of his own socks and one of another player's socks because the socks for the Yankees players had their numbers on them. And he had a 3 home run game. And when he was getting undressed, he noticed that he had two different socks on. So for the rest of his career, he always wore two different socks because he thought it would bring him good luck. Wade Boggs, uh, always ate a plate of fried chicken before his game, no matter what was, every day without fail, ate fried chicken before a game, and he would draw the Hebrew sign for life in the batter's box before he went in, before he stepped into it with his cleat. I mean, these superstitions would really freak players out if they didn't abide by them. If they didn't abide by them, but
Well, it makes me wonder a little bit if, because so much of baseball's history happens pre television,
mm-hmm,
right? I'm wondering if that lack of mass media, which really sort of blossomed in the 1950s onward, helped to cement a more esoteric culture for baseball. So I remember some of these apocryphal stories, and I don't have any of these stories for things like basketball or football. As somebody who's on the periphery of sports
Mhm.
culture, there's something about the mythology of baseball that seems to make its way out of the sports fandom and into the ether that we just kind of seep into the culture with, right? Like Ty Cobb meeting Shoeless Joe Jackson in the liquor store, like
Mhm.
these, you know, American mythological tales. Do you think that that kind of plays a little bit into it? It's this idea that in the height of baseball, the era of baseball, American Pie and baseball, Norman Rockwell time period, when you couldn't get instant communication, it allowed these folk tales to kind of be planted and blossom into their own thing.
Oh, I totally agree with that. And think about this. When you had baseball games broadcast on the radio, that was something that everybody listened to. And it was a unifying thing. It was a thing that brought people together. Um, and the interesting fact about that is, after the New York Yankees, the most popular franchise in the United States was the St. Louis Cardinals, because the St. Louis Cardinals, the St. Louis station that broadcast their radio games, had the strongest signal in the country. So they were getting St. Louis games all the way down in Louisiana. They were getting Cardinals games out in Nevada. So it was just a unifying factor in a more limited media market, and baseball happened to be the sport that everybody gathered around. There were no other sport was broadcast like that. I mean, occasionally boxing fights were. I really think boxing was the sport that gave baseball a run for its money at the time. But yeah, nothing touched baseball until about the '70s, when it started changing. Basketball um, started becoming more popular. Football started becoming more popular. The Super Bowl, which really wasn't a thing until the 1960s, in the '70s started become competing with the World Series as a cultural touchstone. Um,
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because if you look at the history of sportscasting, the sportscaster, the role of the sportscaster was so incredibly important in something like a radio baseball game or a boxing match. And of those two sports that you mentioned, baseball is more not just of a team on the field sport, but a team as in a city, as in a unifying thing where we're all going to group together and sort of root for each other in a way that boxing is not. You don't have, you know, the Chicago boxer that you can like. You look at it, that's an individual, and you look at that and go, oh, I like that person, or I don't like this person, or you know, it might be, oh wow, that guy's from New York, I'm going to root for him, but it's not the same as feeling the sense of ownership, as in my team won, you know, this title in baseball, right? So
I'd say you're correct. Yeah.
yeah. So the sportscaster was very important in terms of letting people know through the radio what was happening.
Hmm.
Boxing has consistently uh, kept that sportscaster tradition, but it's a much more telegenic and dynamic thing to watch, because you're watching this uh, basically the scene of an action movie played out, and you can film it in lots of different ways. Baseball is unfortunately maybe not as telegenic as football or basketball. And so the necessity for the eccentricity of the sportscaster has, I feel, remained very, very important to baseball in a way that it has maybe diminished in other sports. Whereas you see people like Joe Rogan, who used to do commentary on UFC fights, right? Well, I mean, he's there, he's important, he's part of the circus, but he wasn't necessarily as.
Well, you're correct. You're correct. And to add to what you're saying, the sport of baseball is not as fast moving as basketball or hockey or even football, where announcers on those games don't really have a whole lot of time to talk about anything else than what's immediately happening. Baseball is like a series of Sergio Leone-esque showdowns going on where everybody's standing around waiting for somebody to draw and then seeing what the outcome is. And if you're familiar with the game, that's why I challenge people who say, oh, baseball's a boring game. And I always say, if you're familiar with the game, it's actually a very suspenseful and tense game. But that leaves a lot of time for the announcer to have to relay stories. And I think going back to the folklore, a lot of folklore was passed down through baseball announcers, like in my case growing up, Phil Rizzuto, who is New York's version of Harry Carey, or you would say Harry Carey is Chicago's version of Phil Rizzuto, depending on who you're talking to. But Phil Rizzuto would tell stories of playing with Mickey Mantle and playing with Joe DiMaggio and things like that. So while we're watching the game on TV, there's a lot of space for the announcer to inject the folklore of the sport. When you don't get that with football, you don't get that with basketball, you don't get that with hockey. So I think that has a lot to do with the handing down of the stories.
Completely agree. Well, thank you so much, James. I really appreciate it today. Everybody out there, if you liked what we were talking about today, make sure to like, subscribe, share the channel, help us grow. Check out the links in the description. We've got Patreon, all kinds of good stuff going on in there for longer form audio podcasts, things like that. Check out the Patreon. Other things that are going on the channel coming up. Look for more storytelling videos. Check out some additional podcasts we're going to be putting up. And of course, Midnight Mystery School is always delving into the esoteric and interesting borders of reality and fiction. I'm Decker, the Phantom Astronaut, and thank you for watching.